The cabin that triggered the HOA. Tyler Branson wasn't the kind of man who craved attention. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He didn't even have social media. What he had was a love for peace, nature, and solitude. So when he inherited his grandfather's mountain property tucked deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, he saw it as a second chance at life. Tyler had spent the last 10 years working in corporate law, long hours, boardroom battles, and soul-sucking cases that left him feeling empty. When his grandfather passed away and left him a 400-acre mountain estate, complete with old logging trails, a private lake, and a nearly untouched cabin built in the 1940s, Tyler didn't hesitate. He packed up his life in Chicago and moved to the one place that had always brought him peace as a child. But peace wasn't what greeted him. The cabin stood on the far side of a newly built development, Timberwalk Estates, a shiny, modern, upscale HOA community filled with neatly trimmed lawns, overpriced custom homes, and the kind of neighbors who called the police over grass growing 1 inch too high. The developers had built right up to the property line, and though Tyler's land was grandfathered in and legally untouchable, Timberwalk's self-appointed HOA president didn't see it that way. Her name was Karen Whitmore, mid-50s, blonde bob, haircut, pastel polo shirts, and a personality as sharp as broken glass. She wasn't just any neighbor, she was the embodiment of entitlement. The kind of woman who believed she owned the air you breathed if you were within 100 yards of her perfectly landscaped yard. Karen believed Timberwalk was her kingdom. And when she saw Tyler roll in with his rusted pickup truck, hauling lumber and supplies to restore the old family cabin, she saw a threat to her view, a threat to property values, a threat to her control. She tried to play nice at first. You could call passive-aggressive notes taped to Tyler's fence nice. Please adhere to Timberwalk's noise ordinance. No chainsaws after 4 p.m. All visible structures must be HOA approved. Your structure appears ... unapproved. This is a gated community. We'd appreciate you not using our private access road. Tyler ignored them, politely. He wasn't trying to pick a fight. He had no interest in the HOA, and he wasn't even inside their jurisdiction. His grandfather had secured the land long before Timberwalk existed. His cabin sat far beyond their authority. But Karen didn't see boundaries. She saw defiance, and defiance required punishment. It started with visits, unannounced, uninvited. Karen would march up the gravel trail with her clipboard, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, snapping pictures of Tyler's tools, construction, materials, and even his dog. You can't just build whatever you want, she said one afternoon as Tyler hauled a beam into place. I'm not in your HOA, he replied without looking at her. Karen scoffed. We have visual impact rules. Timberwalk views are protected by covenant. That shack of yours is violating our aesthetics. Tyler turned, wiping sweat from his brow. It's a cabin. Been here since 1942. That's not my problem. Karen stared, lips thin. I'll be contacting the authorities. And she did. The police visit. The deputy showed up the next morning, cruising up the dirt trail with lights off. Tyler met him at the base of the cabin's steps, calm and curious. Got a call about an unpermitted build, the officer said, looking around. Tyler smiled. No permit needed. This is private land. County verified it 2 weeks ago. You want the deed? The deputy looked a little embarrassed, but nodded. Tyler brought out a thick folder. Land survey, tax records, original deed from 1937. And, most damning of all, a county letter confirming Tyler's land was outside HOA jurisdiction by a full mile. The officer gave a slow whistle. Guess Karen didn't know that. She knows now, Tyler replied. But knowing didn't stop her. Over the next few weeks, Karen escalated. She filed anonymous complaints about fire hazards, suspicious activity, and even illegal logging. She petitioned the county to redraw the lines. She mailed Tyler fake citations with Timberwalk, HOA, letterhead. But Tyler, methodical and patient, documented everything. Then came the day she cut the chain on his private access road and had a gate installed locking Tyler out of his own driveway. That was the last straw. Tyler didn't just call the sheriff. He called his lawyer. What Karen didn't know, what no one in Timberwalk knew, was that Tyler Branson wasn't just some backwoods handyman. He was a former federal property rights attorney, and he owned the entire ridgeline Timberwalk sat. His grandfather had purchased every acre of surrounding forest decades ago to keep it from being developed, and that included the mineral rights, water access rights, and a forgotten easement the HOA had unknowingly violated when they built a playground on what was technically his land. Karen had been barking at a lion, and the lion had just opened his eyes. Asterisk. The lawsuit that shook the HOA to its core. Tyler stood at the edge of the ridge, sipping coffee from an old enamel mug as the fog lifted from the treetops below. The mountain was quiet, peaceful, but he knew that silence was about to end. What Karen Whitmore had triggered wasn't just a petty dispute. It was a legal reckoning years in the making. She had trespassed. She had cut his chain. She had physically altered a private road that didn't belong to her community. And worst of all, she had interfered with easements, those invisible lines of legal power that stretched beneath the surface of every property, binding owners together in a delicate dance of mutual obligation and rights. Tyler understood those invisible lines better than anyone. He'd spent years defending small farmers and landowners against billion-dollar real estate trusts. He'd fought land grabs, stopped corporate developments, and had even once testified before Congress on abuse of HOA powers. So when Karen locked him out of his own property and threatened to fine him for violating view ordinances, she hadn't just crossed a line. She had detonated a bomb by noon. Tyler had filed a formal civil suit against the Timberwalk HOA for easement violation, unlawful obstruction of private access, willful trespass, and attempted interference with legally deeded land rights. It wasn't just a warning, it was a full-on legal war declaration. His lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Clarice Hastings, specialized in HOA takedowns. She reviewed the documents, raised an eyebrow, and said simply, "Oh, we're going to have some fun with this." Within 48 hours, Timberwalk received a certified notice demanding the immediate removal of the illegally constructed gate, reparations for property damage, and a cease and desist on all further contact with Mr. Branson, unless routed through legal counsel. Karen didn't respond. Not at first. No, she doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers were placed in mailboxes. Emails were blasted to homeowners. Her subject line read, "Emergency threat to community standards, immediate action required." At that meeting, Karen painted Tyler as a rogue squatter, a man illegally camping on Timberwalk borders, destroying wildlife, chopping down trees, and reducing property values by refusing to comply with visual harmony expectations. She printed blurry photos of Tyler's pickup truck and dog, as if they were evidence of criminal behavior. But what Karen didn't expect was for Clarice to show up at the same meeting, invited by one of the homeowners who had grown increasingly suspicious of Karen's overreach. Clarice waited until Karen finished her fear-mongering speech. Then she stood. What followed was less a rebuttal and more a public dissection. Clarice laid out Tyler's ownership records, maps of the land, the easements the HOA had been using illegally for years, and the fact that Timberwalk's own community park, beloved by children and a major selling point for homebuyers, had been built on land Tyler owned. Not only does my client have full legal access to his property, she said, her voice calm and razor-sharp, he has tolerated years of encroachment. You've paved a walking trail over his soil. Your irrigation lines run under his land, and your HOA has been collecting dues and selling homes under the false pretense of complete ownership. That's fraud, whether you knew it or not. Room fell silent. Karen's face drained of color, but Clarice wasn't done. And as of today, she added, we've filed an injunction. You have 72 hours to remove the gate. After that, we will seek damages in excess of $250,000. The meeting ended in chaos. Neighbors turned on Karen, demanding explanations. A young couple with a newborn were furious to learn that their child's favorite play area sat on disputed land. Another man raised concerns about how Karen had been allocating HOA funds. Questions poured in. What else had she done without consent? How many other lines had she crossed? But Karen, stubborn, prideful Karen, was not the type to admit defeat. The next morning, she called the county zoning office, claiming Tyler was operating an unlicensed Airbnb in the cabin. She posted signs on the Timberwalk gates, warning residents not to engage with him, labeling him a dangerous outsider. She even had the nerve to report him to wildlife authorities for illegally keeping a predatory animal, referring to Tyler's gentle black Labrador, Duke. That same day, the county showed up again, this time with permits, complaints, and paperwork from every direction. But this time, Tyler was ready. He brought out the master deed. He brought out his building permits. He even showed them the property tax records Timberwalk had been unknowingly contributing to by way of overlapping services. In fact, the county officers were shocked to discover the HOA had been maintaining and landscaping land they didn't own, using member dues to do so, and filing expenses against parcels that legally belonged to Tyler's estate. That was the crack that broke open the dam. The local newspaper caught wind of it. A story titled HOA Built on Shaky Ground. Local developer used private land without owner's consent ran on the front page. Within 2 days, it was picked up by local TV news. Homeowners across the county started reaching out. Clarice's phone rang off the hook. There were stories of harassment, fraudulent fines, fines for lawn colors, fines for front porch furniture, and even one woman who was fined for hanging a wind chime that Karen claimed interrupted sound consistency in the community. Meanwhile, back on the mountain, Tyler quietly continued his restoration. He installed solar panels, rebuilt the porch, and began crafting the dream his grandfather had always spoken of, a lodge, fully sustainable, open to hikers and nature lovers, free from modern interference. But even as he worked, he knew the war wasn't over. Karen hadn't surrendered. She was preparing her counterstrike, and it came 1 week later in the form of a counter-lawsuit, filed in the county courthouse, accusing Tyler of hostile activity, public endangerment, and destruction of shared resources. It was absurd, but it was loud. She was counting on noise, confusion, and intimidation to wear him down. What she hadn't counted on was that Tyler didn't just own the land. He owned the mineral rights, and the water rights, and the development permissions Timberwalk needed to expand their community into Phase 2, which had already been marketed to buyers, sold in pre-construction, and scheduled to break ground in 3 months. And without his signature, those permits were useless. Karen had trapped herself and she didn't even know it yet. Timberwalk's collapse begins, scandals and revolt by the time fall leaves began to blanket the winding roads of Timberwalk estates. The cracks in Karen Whitmore's empire had turned into gaping, unhideable rifts. Homeowners, once seduced by the clean symmetry of manicured lawns and HOA promises of orderly living, now whispered in driveways, held side gatherings without her, and exchanged emails loaded with frustration. Karen's once firm grip over the neighborhood had become brittle, fragile glass, just waiting to shatter under the pressure of her own misdeeds. Tyler, meanwhile, had remained calm, composed, and unnervingly silent through it all, continuing to restore his grandfather's cabin, laying down stone paths by hand, carving out space for the new lodge kitchen, and planting trees his grandfather once dreamed of seeing grow tall. Every action, every improvement was documented. Every insult, every illegal gate and complaint was added to the evidence pile. And still, Karen kept pushing, convinced she could bully the truth into submission. The counter-lawsuit Karen filed against Tyler, filled with overreaching allegations, and sprinkled with phrases like community, security, threat, and visual disorder impact, was quickly picked apart by Clarice, who filed a motion to dismiss with supporting documentation that shredded Karen's claims. In one pointed line, Clarice wrote, "This suit is not only meritless, but filed in bad faith as an attempt to silence rightful land usage and legal ownership." But that wasn't all. Clarice and her firm filed a formal complaint with the state bar association, accusing the HOA's attorney of knowingly participating in frivolous litigation and abetting fraudulent conduct by Karen and the HOA board. This wasn't just civil courts anymore. It was escalating into professional sanctions, ethics violations, and statewide attention. It was during this time that the first real bombshell landed, not from Tyler, not from Clarice, but from within. Timberwalk itself, a quiet, middle-aged woman named Deborah Stanton, a resident since the first phase of homes was built, had been Karen's treasurer for 5 years. She had always played along, mostly out of fear and not rocking the boat. But seeing Karen double down, seeing neighbors whispered about like criminals, and learning from Clarice's presentation just how much of their community sat on land that wasn't theirs, she snapped. She came forward with 5 years' worth of HOA financial records stored privately on her old laptop, records that showed discrepancies, fake invoices, payments to contractors that didn't exist, HOA dues routed through maintenance accounts that funded Karen's personal landscaping, travel, and even interior design upgrades for her home. Clarice received the data like a gift from the heavens. Tyler, watching the unraveling with quiet intensity, simply said, "Let the mountain speak for itself." The records were compiled, documented, and handed directly to the county's Finance Oversight Committee. And once those findings were verified, it didn't take long for a state audit to be ordered. When auditors arrived clad in navy jackets, holding clipboards, and with expressions carved from stone, they walked through Timberwalk's main office, examined every binder, every check stub, every meeting note. Karen attempted to smile and offer them coffee, but her charm slipped as soon as they began asking for itemized receipts, contractor licenses, and HOA board meeting transcripts that she never thought she'd have to produce. In 3 days, they uncovered over $128,000 in misused funds. And that was just the beginning. At the same time, Tyler decided it was time to send his own message, not in court. Not with more documents, but through a very public announcement. He hosted a community bonfire just beyond Timberwalk's border, on the open clearing near the edge of his cabin property. Flyers were handed out. A banner was draped between 2 pine trees. Let's talk, the land, the truth, and the future. Dozens of homeowners came, curious, skeptical. Some guilty for believing Karen's stories, others grateful someone had finally stood up to her. Under the orange glow of the fire, Tyler stood with Duke beside him and explained everything. His grandfather had protected the land, how the HOA had encroached year after year, and how he had no interest in fighting, only in protecting what was his and ensuring no one else got hurt by Karen's reckless leadership by the end of the night. The crowd stood in stunned silence. A man in his 60s stepped forward and said, "I paid a special assessment last year for a trail expansion. Was that even real?" A mother of 3 asked if their garden, which had been uprooted by an HOA crew under the claim of code violation, had actually violated anything at all. Tyler didn't have all the answers, but Clarice, who also attended, promised a full community Q&A, transparency, and even legal help for residents who had been financially harmed. Karen, from her window across the ridge, saw the flames of that bonfire and heard the faint sound of laughter, stories, and unity she hadn't been invited to. That night, something inside her snapped. Not with rage, not with strategy, but with fear. Her power was dissolving faster than she could spin the narrative, and it didn't stop. A week later, Phase 2 buyers, who had put down large deposits for Timberwalk's expansion homes, were notified by the county zoning board that the permits were on hold because the land required joint signature approval from the adjacent private owner, namely Tyler Branson. The developers, unaware that Karen had clashed with the very man whose signature they now desperately needed, tried to reach out with apologies, deals, and offers. Tyler declined them all. "I'm not interested in selling," he told them. "This land was meant to stay untouched. And after what I've seen, I don't trust anyone here to protect it." Suddenly, the financial future of Timberwalk was hanging by a thread. The HOA could no longer make empty promises to future homeowners. Investors pulled out, home prices dropped. Even existing homeowners began filing internal petitions to remove Karen and disband the board entirely. But the final collapse came with the arrival of an envelope. One Karen received a loan in her mailbox on a rainy October morning. Inside was a formal notice of criminal investigation, naming her as the central figure in a case involving embezzlement, wire fraud, and property misrepresentation. Accompanying it was a subpoena for her personal bank records, tax returns, and access to HOA emails. Her hands shook. Her world, the illusion of control, perfection, dominance, was crumbling. Her own neighbors had turned against her. The gate she ordered built had been dismantled by county workers. The lawyer she'd trusted had resigned, and the man she had tried to label as an outsider, he was now seen as the one who saved them all. The arrest, the aftermath, and the land's legacy. Karen stood at her picture window with trembling fingers, watching the neighborhood she once ruled unravel like a slow-moving avalanche. Her reflection stared back at her older, harder, the mask of control slipping more by the hour. Where there had once been order, respect, even fear from residents, there was now only suspicion, disdain, and whispered calls for her resignation. She barely heard the knock at the door over the sound of her own heartbeat, but she knew the time had come the moment she opened it. 2 plainclothes officers stood on her porch, holding a warrant, their expressions blank but firm. "Ms. Karen Whitmore," one asked, though he already knew the answer. "You're under arrest for suspicion of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty under HOA code enforcement." The click of the handcuffs echoed in her grand entryway like a death bell for the authority she'd once lorded over everyone around her. Neighbors peered through blinds. Some stood openly on their porches. No one spoke, not even her longtime ally from the HOA board who had once called her the backbone of Timberwalk. The silence wasn't in her favor. It was damning. Karen was escorted out, not in protest, but with her head down as the weight of her deeds caught up with her. It wasn't just about a fence, or a cabin, or a gate anymore. It was about years of unchecked power finally being challenged by truth and law, and it all started with a man who just wanted to restore his grandfather's dream on land he already owned. News of Karen's arrest spread quickly. Local papers featured headlines like "HOA President Faces Criminal Charges After Landowner," "Lawsuit Exposes Years of Abuse," and "Timberwalk Implodes, The Fall of a Power-Hungry Leader." Talk shows debated the ethics of HOA power, calling Tyler a quiet hero and Clarice a wrecking ball wrapped in grace. County officials launched a full investigation into Timberwalk's past permits and financial practices. The audit expanded. Deposits for Phase 2 were returned with apologetic letters. A class action lawsuit was filed by a group of homeowners who had been fined, bullied, or misled under Karen's rule. People who had once shrugged off the HOA's rules as just the way things were, now demanding change in this time, with documents, lawyers, and voices that wouldn't be silenced by fear or neighborhood gossip. Meanwhile, Tyler had no interest in media attention or interviews. He spent his days working on the land, finishing the last beams of the lodge roof, sealing the stone patio, and planting apple trees near the base of the ridge, just like his grandfather had always dreamed. Every shovel of dirt was a reclamation of legacy. Every nail hammered was another piece of justice made whole. Duke stayed close by, always alert, but relaxed now that the noise had died down. Occasionally, neighbors would stop by, not to ask, not to pry, but to thank. A young couple brought him homemade bread and jam. A single mother left a note and a box of cookies at the cabin's steps. An older veteran who had clashed with Karen over flagpole height brought over an antique axe his father had used in the woods. None of them stayed long. They understood that Tyler was not seeking glory. He had already won something bigger than a legal case. He had restored balance to a place that had lost its soul. The county, in the wake of scandal, took swift action. A special counsel was appointed to oversee HOA reform in the area, reviewing bylaws, financial checks, and community protections. Workshops were held to teach homeowners about their rights, and new rules were passed requiring regular third-party audits of HOA boards across the state. Timberwalk dissolved its existing HOA leadership and formed a new community council made up of volunteer residents. Karen's name was scrubbed from official documents, and a quiet hush replaced her former presence. Like the way forest air settles after a thunderstorm, Tyler was asked multiple times to join the new council or even run for local office, but he politely declined. "I came here to build a home," he said, standing beneath the lodge's newly finished archway, "not to chase power." That's how it all went wrong in the first place. Still, he offered his legal knowledge freely, drawing up protective guidelines to make sure no future board could ever exploit the residents the way Karen had. His input was carved into the new Timberwalk charter, along with a simple quote from him: "Power belongs to the people who listen, not the ones who shout the loudest." Months passed, and the mountain healed. The walking trails remained open with new signs recognizing Tyler as the owner and steward. The illegal gate was dismantled, its pieces repurposed into benches at the community center. The lodge, now fully complete, opened its doors to the public for the first time. Hikers, writers, and families came to stay for a weekend of nature. Peace and quiet drawn not just by the view, but by the story that had captured the hearts of so many. Some stayed to help Tyler with chores. Others just sat by the fire, sharing stories of how they, too, had once been silenced by people like Karen. And through it all, Tyler listened, never judging, never commanding. He simply offered a warm drink, a kind smile, and a place where people could feel free again. Karen, now awaiting trial, was last seen leaving the county courthouse flanked by her attorneys, her once proud figure diminished by months of disgrace. Most of her co-conspirators had turned state's evidence, and plea bargains were already being drafted. She faced not only criminal charges, but personal lawsuits from residents, some of whom were elderly and on fixed incomes, devastated by the financial harm she caused. The state bar opened disciplinary hearings for the HOA's former legal representative, and multiple real estate agents in the area were now under scrutiny for selling homes using misrepresented boundaries. Timberwalk became a national case study, a cautionary tale taught in law schools, homeowner seminars, and town hall meetings across the country. And yet, amidst the headlines and courtrooms, it was the lodge that stood tallest, a symbol not of victory over an enemy, but of perseverance, decency, and legacy. Tyler often stood at the edge of the deck, looking over the valley as the sun dipped below the hills, remembering his grandfather's stories. He didn't need applause or revenge. The land was safe, the people were free, and the mountain, his mountain, had spoken. Letters from the past and the day the mountain cried winter came early that year, blanketing the upper ridges of the mountain in a soft, solemn hush. Snow dusted the tops of the pine trees like ancient powder from a forgotten world, and the lodge, now fully restored, stood like a sentinel in the heart of that silence. Inside, a fire crackled steadily in the stone hearth, radiating warmth that touched not just the room but the soul. Tyler stood at the edge of his grandfather's old study, now transformed into a quiet retreat where local schoolteachers and artists sometimes came to write or sketch in peace. And today, something unexpected waited for him on the oak bookshelf, a box buried behind stacks of forgotten forestry maps, wrapped in a faded flannel shirt and sealed with string yellowed by time. On the top, in his grandfather's handwriting, it simply said, "For when the mountain speaks again." He sat in the old leather chair, the same one his grandfather used to read bedtime stories from, and carefully opened the box. Inside were letters, dozens of them written in his grandfather's careful cursive. Some were addressed to no one, more like journal entries than correspondence. Others were unfinished drafts, likely never sent. But together, they told a story. Tyler had only heard in fragments about the original battle to preserve the land long before there were blueprints, board meetings, or gated communities. His grandfather, Edward Branson, had once stood exactly where Tyler now stood, not with tools in hand, but with petitions and legal threats thrown at him by the very first wave of developers who saw the mountain not as sacred, but as a commodity, one letter in particular shook Tyler deeply. It was dated 35 years ago and addressed to the then county supervisor. "I fear that one day, when I'm no longer here, those who worship concrete and uniformity will return, wearing friendlier faces and speaking in smiles. But let it be known I did not surrender this land. I only paused the battle for a time. My grandson will know. He'll understand. This land is not meant to be owned in the traditional sense. It belongs to those who love it. And if he's reading this, then I trust the mountain finally chose to speak through him." Tyler set the letter down slowly, eyes misting over, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that this was never just about boundary lines or HOAs. It was legacy, blood, memory. This was his inheritance, not in dollars or deeds, but in purpose. The following days were quiet, but meaningful. Tyler shared excerpts of the letters with the new community council, who requested permission to read one aloud at the annual winter gathering. That event, once a stiff HOA affair filled with complaints and posturing, had become something far more human, a community celebration hosted in the lodge, open to everyone. When the night arrived, families huddled inside as snow gently fell. Outside the lodge windows, children played near the fireplace. Neighbors shared hot cider and laughter. And when the council chair stood at the podium and read Edward Branson's letter to the crowd, there wasn't a single dry eye in the room. Even the new mayor, attending quietly in the back, was moved by the words of a man long gone but whose vision now stood literally around them. But it was what happened the next morning that Tyler would never forget. He woke early, as always, to walk Duke through the wooded trails near the edge of the old property line. The snow was untouched, thick and heavy, muffling every step. As they reached the eastern ridge, Duke suddenly stopped, ears perked, tail stiff. Tyler followed the dog's gaze and saw something he couldn't explain at first. The ancient pine, the tallest one on the ridge, often called the Watcher by locals, was shedding ice from its branches, not in chunks, but in soft waves, as though the tree itself were exhaling. And beneath it, half buried in the snow, was a rusted piece of metal, a plaque, dislodged by frost, or maybe something deeper. Tyler dug it out gently and turned it over. It read, "This land is a promise, not for sale, not for control, for life, for peace, for truth." The timing was uncanny. The moment, surreal. He sat at the base of the tree for a long while, letting the weight of it all settle in. It was as if the mountain itself had been holding on to its own secret, waiting for the right time to let it go. And now it had chosen to remember out loud that day. Tyler placed the plaque at the entrance of the main lodge, mounted on a handcrafted wood base with the help of local teens who had begun volunteering around the property. They asked him questions, eager to hear the story, what it meant, why it mattered. He told them everything, not as a lecture, but as a legacy. He told them about the mountain's voice, about his grandfather, about Karen's downfall not being the end but a turning point. "The land doesn't belong to us," he said. "We belong to it. And when you forget that, bad things happen." Meanwhile, back in town, Karen's trial was set to begin in early spring, but by now, her name barely held power. The state had moved to permanently bar her from ever serving on any HOA board again. Her assets were frozen. She had become a warning, not a presence. More importantly, Timberwalk had transformed from a fractured neighborhood into something like a true community, not perfect, but alive. And every change they made, the transparency reports, the open votes. The refusal to rebuild the illegal gate hall had roots in Tyler's quiet defiance. Visitors came from out of state now to see the lodge. Some came for the view, others came for the story. A few came to stay longer, even built cabins nearby with permission from Tyler, who had developed a modest but strict land-sharing agreement that protected the forest's integrity. He didn't want development, he wanted coexistence, and over time, that vision inspired people. Architects, students, conservationists, saw drawn by one man's choice to protect something bigger than himself. And on the last night of winter, just before the thaw, Tyler stood again at the ridge, this time holding one final letter from his grandfather. It was short, just a single line. When the mountain cries, let it be tears of joy. Tyler looked out over the valley, where the trees swayed gently under the moonlight, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not even peace, but completion. A story had ended, a new one had begun, and for the first time in a long time, the mountain wasn't weeping, it was smiling. Timberwalk reborn, a new kind of homespring arrived, not with fireworks or fanfare, but in the gentle unfurling of buds along the branches, in the quiet drip of melting snow, and in the fresh earthy breath of the mountain waking from its long sleep. The birds returned, first warblers and finches, darting across the open skies of Timberwalk Ridge. Then came the wildflowers, painting color back into the land like strokes of an artist who knew patience and purpose. But more than that, spring brought something that had been missing for years: hope without fear. The old homeowners, who had once walked with shoulders hunched, eyes cast downward to avoid Karen's scrutiny, now strolled freely, greeting one another not out of forced politeness, but genuine warmth. Children played on front lawns that were no longer judged by grass height or garden gnomes, and on Sunday mornings, families gathered on the lodge's front patio, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise without the weight of invisible rules pressing down on them. Inside the lodge, Tyler had transformed the great hall into a shared space for community events. Every week brought something new: a storytelling night, a home repair workshop, even potluck dinners where recipes were passed around as freely as laughter. What was once a solitary man's effort to rebuild a cabin had evolved into a living heartbeat for an entire region. The lodge was no longer just a structure, it was a symbol, a place where people from every walk of life could connect, heal, and remember that home wasn't about property lines or parking notices, was about trust, empathy, and the freedom to breathe. Tyler, though still modest and quiet, had embraced a new kind of leadership, one born not from title or vote, but from action and example. He never declared himself a leader, but the community followed him nonetheless. When an elderly couple's deck collapsed in a spring storm, he rallied neighbors to help rebuild it within days. When a young mother feared eviction due to past fines tied to Karen's illegal charges, he personally contacted the board and had them reversed under the newly ratified fairness policy. He became a bridge between wounds and healing, not just because he had the legal know-how, but because he genuinely listened, something Timberwalk had desperately needed. And yet, Tyler knew he couldn't hold on to the mountain forever, not because he wanted to leave it behind, but because he believed legacy had to grow beyond one man's hands. He began mentoring younger residents who showed promise, not just in leadership, but in kindness. One of them was Ellie, a high school senior who had spent most of her childhood watching her parents fight HOA fines while quietly planting flowers. Anyway, now, under Tyler's guidance, she had started a community garden near the lodge, growing everything from tomatoes to lavender, inviting kids to learn how to tend the soil and elders to teach them wisdom that didn't come from textbooks. Another was Malik, a former construction worker who had once been fined for unauthorized siding and was now leading the Timberwalk restoration crew, a volunteer team that fixed fences, painted homes, and offered assistance with no paperwork or judgment, just respect. The town took notice, not just the residents, but the outside world too. Documentarians came to interview Tyler and the Timberwalk Council about their transformation. One local college created a semester-long course titled Reclaiming Community, the Timberwalk Model, and students from as far as Chicago and Denver made the journey to see firsthand how a neighborhood so divided had come together without corporate oversight or political funding, just through decency, land stewardship, and a willingness to listen. The phrase "the Timberwalk Way" began to show up in blogs, articles, and even real estate brochures, not as a selling gimmick, but as a badge of honor for communities attempting their own reforms across the country. Even the lodge's guest book became a thing of legend. Travelers wrote of how the mountain changed them, how they arrived burdened and left lighter, how they rediscovered creativity, or even found love in the silence. One man, a war veteran from Utah, wrote a note that Tyler would later frame in the study. "I came to forget what I saw overseas. Instead, this place helped me remember what's worth fighting for." Another visitor, a young widow from Texas, wrote, "This land doesn't just speak, it sings, if you're still enough to hear it." And though Karen's name had long faded from daily conversation, her shadow had not disappeared entirely. Her sentencing was finally handed down, a combination of fines, probation, and a lifetime ban from any financial leadership roles. Some said it was too light. Others believed it was justice enough. But for Tyler, it was never about how hard she felt. It was that the people she'd hurt had risen back up. When he got the letter confirming the final judgment, he read it once, folded it, and placed it inside a hollow in the old watcher tree at the ridge. "Let the mountain keep it," he said quietly to Duke, who stood faithfully beside him. "It knows what to do with old ghosts." As the years passed, Timberwalk grew not in size, but in spirit. Weddings were held at the lodge. Babies were named after Edward and other forgotten elders who had once walked these woods with dreams too fragile for their time. A hiking trail was named Clarice's Way, honoring the woman who had walked into the heart of Karen's domain and helped bring the truth into the light. And Tyler, older now, with streaks of silver in his beard, often sat on the back porch in the evening, sipping tea and watching the forest sway gently in the wind. He never saw himself as a hero. Heroes, he believed, were people who did what was right without needing to be right. He had simply come to rebuild a cabin. What he rebuilt instead was a community, and the mountain. Oh, the mountain thrived. It no longer stood silent and forgotten, but alive with songbirds, laughter, and footsteps of those who walked not to escape the world, but to become part of it. Trees grew taller, streams ran clearer, the air smelled of pine and legacy, and though Tyler would one day pass into memory like his grandfather before him, the land would remain, cradling every story told upon it, every stand made for it, and every moment of quiet joy it had given. In the end, the mountain did not belong to Tyler, nor to Timberwalk, nor to any deed or board or policy. It belonged to the people who dared to listen,